folks, George here again. Today we're going to continue our discussion about what is the nature of reality and how do we know about reality. I'm going to frame this within the context of a table. What is the true nature of a table and how do we know about the table? In the past, we've discussed this rationalist and empiricist debate between Descartes and Locke, whereas Descartes comes to the conclusion that the only way to know about reality is via rationalism or reasonable thinking. And then Locke concludes the exact opposite, that we need empirical thinking or sensory experience to teach us about the true nature of the table and to teach us about knowledge in general. Today we're going to visit two more empiricists who are going to diverge a great deal from Locke, and they're going to come to radically different conclusions than Locke does. The first philosopher we'll discuss today is Bishop George Berkeley. And George Berkeley is an empiricist, but I love how he carefully defines empiricism and thus reaches and directs us into radically different entailments regarding where empiricism will take us, or rather where it will not take us. So let's start with George Berkeley's formulation of empiricism and, of course, of reality according to empiricism. We'll recall, of course, that empiricism teaches us that we learn about reality. We learn everything, in fact, via sensory experience. And, of course, Locke agrees with that. However, George Berkeley refines that a little bit and says, what do we know about reality? Well, according to empiricism, which is sensory experience, gives us knowledge. According to empiricism, esse est precipi, or to be is to be perceived. After all, isn't that exactly what empiricism suggests? That to exist is to be perceived. That's exactly what empiricism says, right? After all, how do you know that anything exists without perceiving it? You can't. And that's just by the empirical foundation. That is, after all, what empiricism dictates, isn't it? So keep that in mind, that, again, a famous Latin phrase, esse est precipi. To be is to be perceived. What does that entail for George Berkeley? For George Berkeley, he concludes that the only philosophical conclusions we can come to are those of subjective idealism. Subjective idealism, what does that suggest? Subjective idealism suggests that the only thing that exists are minds and perceptions in minds. Now, you'll note that going all the way back, we've had dualist philosophies, such that Plato, let's say, said there's the physical realm, but there's also that spiritual realm where minds and souls exist. Then, of course, Aristotle suggested there are no external realms or additional realms. There's only the physical realm. So Aristotle was a monist, whereas Plato was a dualist. Well, now we've got another monist, George Berkeley, except that Berkeley takes his monism in a different direction. He says there's only one type of realm, and that is the mental or spiritual realm. The physical world doesn't exist outside of the mind. So subjective idealism teaches us. We'll recall the question posed by Bertrand Russell. How do we know that there's a table outside of my mind? I know that I perceive a table, but how do I know that that table exists outside of the mind? Well, I've already spoiled it for you. George Berkeley is going to say there is no table outside of the mind. And thus, subjective idealism. Only ideas exist. Only minds exist. And the ideas within minds. Let's see how he goes there. It's going to start, of course, with his famous phrase, Esse est precipi. Esse est precipi. Well, he suggests, what does that entail? Active being is what I call mind, spirit, soul, or myself. He takes this a bit further and suggests that most people believe that sensible objects exist outside of the mind, outside of being perceived. But this is nonsense. Why is it nonsense? Because esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. To be is to be perceived. Therefore, if you're not perceived, if you don't exist inside a mind, you don't exist at all. There is no existence outside of the mind. Esse est percipi. Here's another way to frame that. Here's how I'm framing it slightly different. What is a perception that isn't perceived? Again, George Berkeley reminds us that's absurd. That's nonsense. What does that lead us? Everything is like what Locke had suggested is a secondary quality. Everything only exists in the minds. Empiricism entails this. If you are an empiricist, the only thing that you can conclude is that perceptions exist. Only perceptions, only in the mind. According to empiricism, esse est percipi, according to Berkeley. After all, how do you know that anything exists at all? By perceptions. That's the definition of empiricism. So do we see that trick that Berkeley played right there? He takes us from empiricism and refines the definition of empiricism to suggest, doesn't empiricism really mean to be is to be perceived? How else do you know that something exists? But by perceiving it. So then, how do you suggest, Locke or anybody else, that there's a table outside of perceptions? That's a step that you're not justified in taking. After all, this I know exists. Going back to Descartes, recall, I think, therefore I am. Even if I am being deceived, I know that I exist. Berkeley is suggesting, yeah, that's right. I know that I exist because I perceive myself. Why would you suggest that anything outside of your perceptions exists? Why would you suggest that when you close your eyes, anything that you cannot perceive still exists? Berkeley has a way out of this, by the way. I'll get to it in a quick second. But it's complete nonsense if you're an empiricist to suggest that things exist outside of your perception. And that's going to be George Berkeley's great contribution to this discussion. What is the reality of a table? It's in here. The true table is a table that I perceive, not a table out there, outside of my mind. So, back to Bertrand Russell's question, how can we prove the existence of a table outside of the mind? George Berkeley says, you can't. There's no reason to believe in a table outside of the mind. I know that I see a table, but where are perceptions? Perceptions are in here, in my mind. Why jump to a conclusion that's nonsense, that there's a table outside of my mind? Now, back to the question of, does that mean that when I do this, all of you and everything else stops existing? Well, George Berkeley was a bishop in the church, and as such, he believed in God. And how is it that things don't pop in and out of existence? Well, God is infinite, therefore, even when I close my eyes, right? even when I close my eyes. At least things continue existing in God's mind. Is that a little tricky? Maybe, maybe not. Right? I don't know how that fits for you. Previously, we talked about Descartes and how Descartes brings God into the picture to prove the existence of a table outside of his mind. Now, George Berkeley is saying, yes, there's a table outside of my mind also, but it's in God's mind. I wonder. Now, of course, like I just said, George Berkeley was a bishop. My hunch, however, is, can you be an atheist and believe in this subjective idealism? Well, we're going to see in a minute David Hume, who is going to be an atheist and is just going to say, yeah, things will pop in and out of existence. What's wrong with that? You don't exist? You do exist. You don't exist? You do exist. What's the problem with that, philosophically speaking? What's the problem with things popping in and out of existence? Well, if you're an idealist, a subjective idealist, I don't really see a problem. Now, George Berkeley believes in this thing called God, so George Berkeley has a way of saying that things continue to exist, even when I'm not looking. By the way, I live here in New York. Does China exist right now, despite the fact that I don't see China, and I've never been to China either, that I'm not perceiving China? For George Berkeley, of course China exists. Why? Because China exists in the mind of 1 billion Chinese who are there right now, perceiving China. There's no philosophical problem with that, is there? That's an interesting sort of question for you to tackle. What do you think? Do foreign countries that you don't perceive exist? George Berkeley's got no problem. Other minds perceive these places. Therefore, they exist in other minds. Not in my mind, but they do exist in other minds. Therefore, they exist in minds. But they do stay in minds. Not out in something outside of a mind. That is rather counterintuitive. But if you are an empiricist, doesn't the logic follow? If you believe that knowledge comes from sensory experience, then doesn't that mean that all we have is sensory experience? We can't jump to an additional conclusion that something exists outside of sensory experience. David Hume is going to take Berkeley's empirical tradition and take it a few steps further still. Well, I've already told you that David Hume is an atheist. He doesn't believe in God. Therefore, I don't think that David Hume would have a problem with things popping in and out of existence as long as nobody is perceiving them. As a matter of fact, Hume is going to go so much further that many philosophers categorize Hume within this school of thought of skepticism. What is skepticism? Skepticism is the position such that real knowledge is impossible. What does that mean? Well, Hume is going to say knowledge, certainly of tables outside of the mind, is impossible. But he's going to say a few more things are impossible, and in terms of real knowledge. He's going to conclude that all of our knowledge of cause and effect is not knowledge at all. Hume is also going to conclude that inductive knowledge is not knowledge at all. We'll talk about both of those in a quick second. I like giving the example of sounds, right? Here's an example of cause-effect. I've got one hand, I've got another hand. What caused the sound that we heard? Well, those of us who like following our intuitions would say that the two hands coming together caused the sound. Hume is going to say, you don't know that. We can't know cause-effect relationships. What's an example of inductive knowledge? Well, one piece of inductive knowledge is drawing the conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow. Why is it that I know that the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, it's inductive knowledge such that I've observed suns rising for every day of my life. Every day of my life, I've observed suns rising. Tomorrow is another day. Therefore, I predict that the sun will rise tomorrow. I claim to know that the sun will rise tomorrow. Those of us who believe in inductive knowledge know that the sun will rise tomorrow. I'm asking you all now, do you know that the sun will rise tomorrow? Many of us, yeah, I would bet $1 million that the sun will rise tomorrow. Is that knowledge, though? Is that knowledge? Hume is going to say no. Let's step back and see how his argument works. Hume is going to start with the notion that there are only two kinds of knowledge. The first kind of knowledge is a matter of fact. This is empirical knowledge, right? One suggestion might be that I know the jacket is blue. That's a matter of fact. How do I know? I look at the jacket or the blazer and I say it's blue. I know that the shirt is black. Now, if we recall our George Berkeley says, wait, there is no blazer outside of the mind. There is no shirt outside of the mind. Fine, but there is a blazer in the mind, and there is a shirt in the mind. And the blazer in my mind is blue, and the shirt in the mind is black. That is a matter of fact. That is one kind of knowledge. The other kind of knowledge, Hume is going to say, is called relation of ideas. What does that entail? A relation of ideas is something like all bachelors are unmarried men, or all triangles have three sides. How do we know that all bachelors are unmarried men? Well, it's by relation of ideas. It's what the word bachelor means and what the word unmarried man means. How do I know that all triangles have three sides? Again, because of the relation of ideas. It's what the word means, triangle, and what the words mean, three sides, a shape with three sides. And that is knowledge. I know that triangles have three sides by relation of ideas. By matters of fact, I know that the blazer is blue. Now, let's talk about I know that the hands caused the sound. The clapping hands caused the sound. Let's look at it. Is it a matter of fact? Well, I see two hands. I see two hands come together. I hear a sound. All of those would be matters of fact. But what didn't I say? Isn't it going a step further to say the two hands caused the sound? Hume is not going to deny there's two hands. Hume will agree the two hands came together. Hume will agree that there was a sound. Hume will stop when you say, so therefore the hands caused the sound. He's going to go, bah, 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 bah. Why do you jump to that conclusion? That's not a matter of fact, is it? Furthermore, is it a relation of ideas? Well, let's think about that. Think about a classic paradigmatic example of relation of ideas. A triangle is a shape with three sides. Well, we know that by the meaning of the word triangle and the meaning of the words shape with three sides. is there anything in the meaning of hands and sound such that hands must create a sound, that they're related in this necessary way, like relation of ideas? Hume is going to say no. So if the hands cause the sound, if that's not a matter of fact, and it's not a relation of ideas, guess what? It's not knowledge. To claim that the hands caused the sound is not knowledge. Hume even says, by the way, there's a million possible interpretations that are just as logically relevant to this notion that sound followed from hands coming together. What else could it be? Well, maybe there's a little demon inside my skin that screams every time my hands come together like that. Maybe the demon inside my hands caused the sound. Now, Hume wouldn't believe that. I don't believe that. But is there any way to disprove that? Hume is going to say no way. Hume is going to say no way. Let's go to the other kinds of knowledge that we claim to have that Hume will deny. Inductive knowledge. Will the sun rise tomorrow? Yes, Hume will agree. The sun rose every day for the past 40-some years of my life. Yes, the sun rose today. However, do you know that the sun will rise tomorrow? Hume will say, no way. You don't know that. Because after all, there's only two kinds of knowledge. Matters of fact and relation of ideas. Is it a matter of fact? Well, how do we discover matters of fact? I know this matter of fact that my blazer is blue. How did I know that? By seeing it. Guess what I never see? Tomorrow. I do not see tomorrow. Therefore, it can't be a matter of fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. I don't see tomorrow. Can you see tomorrow? I mean, if you could, you shouldn't be watching this video. You should go to, let's say, the horse track or go to a bookie and gamble on some sports about that happen tomorrow. But for the rest of us, we can't see tomorrow. Therefore, it's not a matter of fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. What about relation of ideas? Well, is there anything in the meaning of tomorrow, or anything in the meaning of sun, or anything in the meaning of rise, that all those must come together? That the sun will rise tomorrow? Absolutely not. There's nothing logically necessary about those three ideas coming together to say, therefore I know the sun will rise tomorrow. In the same way, remember the paradigmatic example of the matter of fact, that I know that a triangle is a shape with three sides. That's a relation of ideas. There's no relation of ideas between sun, rise, and tomorrow such that they all come together. By counterexample, the earth might blow up tomorrow. The sun might blow up tomorrow. I hope not. And I wouldn't bet on it. But I don't know it. Therefore, there is no knowledge of cause-effect relationships, and there's no knowledge of inductive conclusions, such that we can tell the future. What is this based upon? This is based upon Descartes' idea of knowledge being that indubitable thing. Remember, Descartes asked us, what is this indubitable foundation upon which I can build all other knowledge? So Descartes has already defined knowledge as this indubitable thing. Hume is going along that line and saying, yeah, I agree with you, Descartes. Knowledge is this thing of which we cannot doubt. I can't doubt that triangles are shapes with three sides. I can't doubt that there's a perception of a blue blazer right now. But I can doubt that these hands caused the sound, and I can doubt that the sun will rise tomorrow. Therefore, it's not knowledge. Therefore, isn't all science, according to Hume's conclusions here, isn't all science not knowledge? After all, most of science is about cause-effect relationships and inductive conclusions. All science tells us this sort of stuff. So what is Hume saying about science? It's not knowledge. What does this mean about science, about knowledge, about philosophy? Well, Hume leaves us with this fascinating quote. He says, "Most fortunately it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose, and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind, or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterates all these chimera. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends. And when after 3 or 4 hours of amusement, I return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any further." I love that admission by Hume right there. What is Hume really saying in that quote? Well, some people might interpret it as, well, Hume is what? Contradicting himself? I don't think so. I think what Hume is really saying is, here are the limits of philosophy, and here are the limits of knowledge. After all, those of us who are interested in religious philosophy, philosophy of religion, will read a lot of Hume, because Hume is an atheist who gives a lot of arguments in favor of atheism and against the existence of God. And some of those arguments depend on the truth of science. What does that mean? Especially since he just dispelled that science gives us knowledge. Well, if we read that passage one more time, these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any further. I think that Hume is acknowledging that he can believe in science, but that philosophy, especially this trend of modern philosophy that Descartes has paved the way for us to pursue, this philosophy isn't the key of knowledge. Or rather, this philosophy doesn't give us knowledge. If we look within this Cartesian framework, it's impossible to gain knowledge. What does that suggest? I think what Hume is suggesting is that there are limits to philosophy, limits to philosophical thinking. He, of course, continues to believe in science. He, of course, continues to believe in his friends and his dinner and his games of backgammon. But he sees the limits, I think, of philosophy and says, if philosophy in this Cartesian tradition is going to ask for indubitable knowledge, then I must be a skeptic. And I must say, I give up. It's impossible. If we take Descartes' path of looking for indubitable knowledge, it's impossible. Therefore, philosophically speaking, I'm a skeptic. that makes me wonder, am I wasting my time reading and thinking about philosophy? Well, I know some people will say, yeah, of course you are, because I've got more important things to do. But I wonder where this might take us. I wonder then, what is left for philosophy? Well, Kant tries to save the day. We'll talk about Kant next time. Bye-bye.